Let's look at the process you would use for a typical Windows installation. The first step is actually an optional step depending on the type of configuration you want to use. If you want to use a RAID configuration for your system disk, such as RAID 0 or 1 or 5, you need to know that Windows as a desktop operating system does not support configuring these RAID levels for your system disk. That means you must configure these RAID arrays prior to installing Windows. The way that you configure this is typically to go into the BIOS and from there identify the boot order, and if you're using serial ATA disk, you would typically choose a RAID setting for the disk. Then you'd boot into the setup program that came with your RAID controller, and here you would define your arrays. So for instance, if you wanted to configure a RAID 5 array, you'd have 3 disks, and you would group those into a logical disk that would be the target for your installation. The second step would be to choose the destination to boot your computer. If you're performing an in-place upgrade, you would boot to your current operating system. If you're performing a new or a custom install, you would go into your BIOS and configure the boot order to boot to the optical disk where you have the installation for Windows. The third step is to start the install. So for instance, if you're doing an in-place upgrade, you would boot into your operating system, insert the disk, and run the setup program from the disk to start the installation. If you're doing a new installation, you would boot from the operating system installation media, and then this would start what is typically called the text-based portion of the install. Here you do not have access to the mouse for making your choices within the installation. During this text-based install, the first step that is performed is to add the files that are required by the installation. And this includes loading initial driver files. If in step 1 you chose to use a RAID disk to hold your system files, during this process within the installation, you would need to load the driver that allows you to access your RAID array. When you're installing Windows XP, you would press F6 when prompted. There would be a message at the bottom of the screen that asks you to press F6 if you needed to load additional SCSI or RAID controller drivers. For Windows 7, there's actually a GUI portion of the install where you simply select the driver. After this portion of the installation, you're asked to select the install location or the disk where you want to install Windows. If you're using a RAID configuration and you forgot to load the driver during this initial part of the installation, when you get to this part, you will not be able to see your array to select it to install Windows. At this point in Windows XP, your only choice is to restart your upgrade, to restart the installation process in order to load the appropriate drivers at the right time. When you choose the installation disk, you have the option to partition the disk. In other words, you can create partitions on your disk. Instead of taking the entire disk for the operating system, you could create a small partition that's used for the operating system files. If you choose to partition, you can also format. However, usually your choice of formatting is restricted to NTFS. Current versions of Windows can only install on NTFS drives. If you simply choose the disk without custom partition and format information, Windows will take the entire drive, create a single partition using that drive, and format it with NTFS to begin the installation. After the disk is partitioned and formatted, there's additional file copy activity that happens during the install. And at this point, once the file copy is completed, you'll see a reboot. At this point, don't get in too big of a hurry. Leave the installation disk in and let Windows complete the installation. When it reboots, it will continue with the installation process where it asks for configuration information. This part of the install is often called the GUI portion of the install. When you're in Windows XP, you'll now be able to use the mouse, and you'll see windows and buttons to click on. During this stage of the installation, you'll choose things such as a username, a computer name. You might enter in the license code for Windows XP. You'll choose any networking settings that you want to use on the computer. At this point, however, there's really not too many things that you can do with the installation. You simply answer a few questions, and then the installation continues. And finally, after the configuration is done, you'll typically have another reboot, and then you will finally log on to Windows. Depending on the operating system type, you might also be prompted at this point to activate Windows or to perform any additional post-installation activities. So that's the basic process of installing Windows from an installation disk. However, there are also several other methods you can use for installing Windows other than through the installation disk. One method you could use is to create a USB device that has the contents of the installation disk. Then you configure the BIOS to boot from the USB device instead of from the CD or DVD drive. And you would run the installation process from the USB device. Another option is to configure a network installation. In this case, again, you copy the installation disk contents to a network share. Using this method, you have to boot the computer to an operating system. And this may be a limited operating system, perhaps on a USB drive. It has to be an operating system that gives you network access so that you can connect to the network share and begin the installation process. In an enterprise environment, you may be able to configure your computer to boot to the network itself. However, you can't just boot to the network share to start the installation. You instead have to boot to a special computer which sends some limited information to your computer and allows it to connect to the network share and to begin the installation. This process for Microsoft is done with a server called a remote installation server. The process begins by configuring the BIOS to boot from the network and then loading files on the server on the network that allow it to access the network share and start the installation. Another method you could use is called disk imaging. When you do disk imaging, you install Windows on one computer. So you would run through a normal installation with the installation disk on a typical computer. You would take the hard drive within that computer and you'd use a disk duplication process to copy the contents of the hard drive to multiple destination hard drives. And those hard drives are inside additional new computers. This process of copying this image to the other images is much faster than the process of installing Windows and going through all those prompts. So once you have your first computer set up, you can quickly image or copy the information to other hard drives in order to quickly configure these other computers. When you use this method, each of these computers needs to have very similar hardware because the configuration information stored on this disk will need to be compatible with the information that's stored on the other disks. Prior to performing the copy, you do run a command on this drive which prepares it for this copy, and it removes any information that might be unique to this one computer. A final method would be an unattended installation. With an unattended installation, you would run through the installation on one computer, and you would create a file which contains all of the answers to the questions that are asked during the installation. You would then go to another computer and you would start that installation and specify this file to use during the installation. The installation would then proceed without you having to sit at the computer and answer the questions during the installation. So you might be able to run to multiple computers and start the installation process. When you come back a while later, the installation will be finished on all of them without you having to go to each one to answer the questions. In a simple scenario, installation is as easy as booting to the installation disk, answering a few questions, and letting the installation proceed. You could also use other techniques to help simplify the installation when you have multiple computers that you need to install.